The chandeliers of Blackwood Manor seemed to dim the moment Lord Marcus Thorne raised his voice. All music stopped. 200 pairs of eyes, the cream of society, turned to face the grand staircase where he stood beside his fiancée, Lady Alara Vance. I, Duke Alistair Beaumont, was near the orchestra, and I felt the air itself turn to ice. This was not an announcement, it was an execution. "I must inform you all," Marcus declared, his voice ringing with a false practiced sorrow, "that my engagement to Lady Alara is hereby dissolved." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Fans fluttered, and whispers erupted like a plague of locusts. Marcus held up a hand for silence, savoring his power. "I have discovered, to my profound dismay," he continued, his gaze sweeping over Alara with performative disgust, "that the Vance family is utterly bankrupt. A desperate fortune hunter has no place by my side." The words were a blade, intended to sever her from society forever. I watched her, expecting tears, a denial, a collapse. But Lady Alara did nothing. She stood perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands clasped before her. Her face was not one of shame, but of unnerving, crystalline calm. She looked at Marcus, not as a victim, but as if he were a mildly interesting specimen under glass, and in that chilling silence, as the world condemned her, a single thought struck me with the force of a premonition. This is not a breakdown. This is a calculation. The room saw a ruined woman. I saw a strategist watching her enemy make his final fatal move. Why was she so quiet? What did she know that we did not? Weeks before that night, I realized their engagement was not what it seemed. It happened at my own dinner table. Marcus was speaking. Of course he was. He always filled a room as if it already belonged to him. But that evening, something in his tone shifted. Subtle, controlled, dangerous. "And Alara," he said, lifting his glass slightly in her direction, "will soon understand that the mistress of a Thorne estate must prioritize duty above personal inclinations. The gardens, for instance, will require discipline." It sounded like admiration. It wasn't. It was instruction. A quiet ripple passed through the table. Most ignored it. They always did. Power often disguises itself as charm. But I watched her. Lady Alara smiled, softly, politely. And yet, there was something beneath it. Not submission, not discomfort. Calculation. "A garden, like a marriage, Lord Thorne," she replied, her voice calm enough to soothe the room, "thrives on mutual respect, not discipline. I am certain we will both have much to learn." The air tightened. It was a perfect answer, elegant, harmless, and yet, unmistakably, resistance. Marcus smiled back, but his eyes didn't. That was the first moment I understood. This was not a romance, it was a negotiation, and neither of them intended to lose. I began watching them more closely after that. At the Ashworth Gala, I found them near the library doors, partially closed but not enough to conceal everything. Marcus's voice had changed. Gone was the charm. "What I require is certainty, Alara," he said low and sharp. "Your father's accounts, are they truly as stable as he claims?" Silence. Then her voice, measured, deliberate. "My father's affairs are in order, my lord. Formal, cold, a wall. That is all you need to know." A pause followed. Not the pause of a couple. The pause of two people testing boundaries. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I am only ensuring your future is secure." No, he was ensuring his investment was. Even from a distance, it was clear. This was not concern. This was verification. And for the first time I asked myself, what was he expecting to find? But it was not until the garden party that the illusion truly fractured. The afternoon was bright, the atmosphere light, laughter, music, the usual performance of perfection. And yet, something in him felt urgent, impatient. He reached for her, not her hand, the locket, a small silver piece she wore constantly, so unremarkable most would ignore it. He didn't. "A sentimental object?" he asked almost playfully. But his eyes betrayed him. They weren't curious. They were hunting. Alara's reaction was immediate. Her hand rose, fast, instinctive, shielding it. For a fraction of a second, The entire world disappeared from her expression. No grace, no softness, only something fierce, untouchable. "It is private." 2 words, quiet, final, the kind of answer that doesn't invite repetition. Marcus laughed, too quickly, too lightly. But something had already broken. He stepped back, and for the first time, he looked like a man who had just realized a door was locked. That was when everything became clear. He was not courting her. He was searching her, testing her, measuring her worth against something he had not yet confirmed, and she knew. She wasn't reacting. She was allowing him to reveal himself, piece by piece, mistake by mistake. From that moment on, I stopped seeing an engagement. I saw a siege, and I could not yet determine who was under attack, or who was setting the trap. In the weeks that followed the Blackwood Ball, society solidified its judgment. Lady Alara Vance was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered over tea and cards. Lord Marcus Thorne, in contrast, was celebrated as the shrewd man who had unmasked a charlatan. He played the part of the reluctant victim perfectly, accepting condolences with a weary sigh. But I could not reconcile the man on display with the predator I had observed. The first crack in his story appeared at my club. Marcus was surrounded by sympathizers, a brandy in his hand. "You had a fortunate escape, Thorne," said Lord Pemberley. "Imagine being shackled to a family of debtors." Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It wasn't an escape," he said, his voice low and laced with something venomous. "It was a necessary amputation." He took a sharp drink. "The true pity is that she vanished before she could be made to fully account for her deception." The men nodded, but I saw it differently. He wasn't relieved, he was furious. Why would a man who had successfully dodged a trap be angry that the trap had disappeared? It was the fury of a hunter whose prize had slipped through his fingers at the last moment. He didn't just want to be rid of her. He wanted something from her. This suspicion spurred me to action. I instructed my man of affairs, a discreet and thorough individual, to make inquiries into the Vance family's departure. The official story was that they had fled their creditors in the dead of night. The truth, I soon learned, was far different. There were no outstanding debts. Every local tradesman had been paid in full, their accounts settled meticulously the morning after the ball. Their household staff had been dismissed not with apologies, but with generous severance. This was not the chaotic flight of a ruined family. It was a planned, orderly, and solvent withdrawal. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to test Marcus myself. I found him at a soirée hosted by the Duchess of Arlington, looking every bit the triumphant bachelor. I approached him under the pretense of offering my own belated sympathies. "Thorne," I began, my tone even, "I was sorry to hear of your ordeal, though I must say I heard from a source in the country that the Vance affairs were left in surprisingly good order." His composure fractured. A flicker of panic, quickly masked by rage, crossed his face. "Do not speak her name to me, Crestwood," he hissed, his grip tightening on his glass. "Her family's pathetic pride means nothing. They are destitute, I assure you." His defensiveness was a confession. He was not just lying, he was desperately protecting a lie. I gave a slight bow and walked away, but I lingered in the adjoining conservatory, shielded by the palms. Moments later, Marcus stormed in, cornering his solicitor. I could not hear every word, but a few phrases cut through the air like daggers. "Utterly gone. Find her. It must be connected to her mother's line. The Earl of Silverwood." The Earl of Silverwood. He had been one of the wealthiest, most reclusive men in the kingdom, having died only months ago without a known heir. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces began to shift into a new, far more dangerous shape. This was never about the Vance family's modest fortune. It was about an inheritance of unimaginable scale. The name Silverwood became an obsession. My solicitor, a man who could unearth a secret from bedrock, began his work. The findings were laid out on my desk a week later, a tapestry of secrets and greed. The late Earl of Silverwood, a notorious eccentric, had indeed disowned his only daughter decades ago for marrying beneath her station to a simple gentleman named Vance. The Earl never publicly reconciled with her, and she had passed away some years before him. But in his final days, consumed by regret, the Earl had drafted a new will. a document, legally ironclad, that bypassed all distant relations and named his only living descendant as his sole heir, his granddaughter, Ilara Vance. The report was staggering. Ilara was not just an heiress, she was a queen in waiting, poised to inherit a fortune that dwarfed half the duchies in the kingdom. Lord Marcus Thorne had not been hunting a modest country fortune. He had been stalking one of the largest inheritances of the century. But this only deepened the central mystery. If Marcus knew of this colossal fortune, why detonate the engagement? Why publicly humiliate the source of his future wealth? It was the act of a madman, unless the humiliation itself was part of the plan. I began to suspect something far more sinister than simple greed. To test this theory, I needed to corner my quarry. I hosted a small, exclusive chess tournament at Crestwood Manor, an arena of quiet intellect and brutal strategy. The perfect place to make a move. I made sure Marcus Thorne received a personal invitation. To refuse would be an insult. He arrived confident, basking in his renewed social standing. I found him observing a match between two aging barons. "A fascinating game, is it not, Thorne?" I said, standing beside him. "So much depends on anticipating your opponent's strategy." He nodded, a tight smile on his face. "Indeed, Crestwood. Some players are more predictable than others." I let the comment hang in the air before I made my move. "Speaking of strategy," I said, my voice casual, "I've been considering acquiring some land to the east. A fascinating property has come to my attention. The old Silverwood estate. I hear its ownership is complicated." The effect was instantaneous. The blood drained from his face. His hand, resting on the back of a chair, clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. "Some lands are best left undisturbed, Duke," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "On the contrary," I replied, looking directly at him. "I find that forgotten legacies have a way of re-emerging, often with surprising force." I saw Lady Ashworth, a woman whose influence could make or break a reputation, turn her head slightly from across the room. Her sharp, intelligent eyes registered the exchange, the palpable tension radiating from Marcus. A seed of public doubt had been planted. Marcus excused himself abruptly, his composure shattered. I knew then that I was right. But knowing his motive wasn't enough. I needed to find Ilara, not to rescue her, but to understand her strategy. My solicitor's report noted the generous severance paid to the Vance staff. A loyal servant would not abandon their mistress. I had my man track down Ilara's former lady's maid, a woman named Clara. I found her in a small but respectable cottage on the edge of my own lands. She was frightened, fiercely loyal, and refused to speak. "I am not her enemy," I told her gently. "Lord Thorne is a danger to her, and I believe she is still in his sights. Help me protect her." Her eyes filled with tears, but not of fear for her mistress. They were tears of anger. "Protect her," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Your Grace, you misunderstand. Lady Ilara does not need protection. She needs time." I was confused. Time for what? Clara looked at me, and her expression was one of absolute conviction. It was the final, stunning twist that changed everything. "She didn't flee from him, Your Grace," she said. "She was preparing. She told me the day before the ball, 'Tomorrow he will try to destroy me. All he will destroy is himself.' She knew, Your Grace. She knew everything. She knew." The words echoed in my mind, reconfiguring the entire narrative. Ilara was not a victim in hiding. She was a general who had made a strategic retreat. Her disappearance wasn't a surrender, it was a mobilization, and Marcus, swaggering through society's drawing rooms, was a man marching blissfully into a perfectly laid ambush. I now understood my role. I was not her rescuer. I was her ally, the heavy artillery she needed to ensure the battlefield was ready for her return. My first step was to turn whispers into conversation. The Silverwood name, once a forgotten echo, needed to become the topic of the season. I began subtly. At dinners, I would mention the remarkable story of the late Earl, his eccentricities, his lost daughter. I commissioned a new portrait of my grandmother, a distant cousin of the Silverwoods, and hung it in my main hall, ensuring all my guests would see it and ask about the connection. The name Silverwood began to circulate, linked to Crestwood, lending it legitimacy and intrigue. My second move was to create a sense of impending revelation. The annual Grand Crestwood Ball was approaching, the most anticipated social event of the year outside of the royal court itself. I let it be known through my steward, a man whose discreet pronouncements were society's most reliable source of gossip, that a special announcement would be made that evening. An announcement concerning a matter of a great and unexpected inheritance. The ton was electric with speculation. Was it about me, a distant relative? The bait was set. Marcus, I knew, would be unable to resist. He would have to attend, to stand at the center of the storm and project an air of unconcern, all while his insides were likely twisted in knots. The final piece of my strategy was to isolate him socially, even within a crowded room. I began extending invitations to small, influential gatherings, dinners, card games, hunting parties, and conspicuously omitted Lord Thorn. When asked, I would offer a cool, ambiguous reply. I find myself preferring company of a more transparent nature of late. The slight was noticed. Alliances are the currency of our world, and to see the Duke of Crestwood publicly withdraw his favor was a devastating blow. Other influential figures began to follow my lead, their own invitations to Marcus mysteriously drying up. He was no longer the celebrated survivor, he was becoming a social pariah, though no one could yet articulate precisely why. On the day before the ball, I received a coded message delivered by a boy from the village where Clara resided. It contained only 3 things: a time, a location within my own gardens, and a single pressed silver leaf. Ilara was ready. She was coming to Crestwood. That evening, I saw Marcus at the opera. He looked haunted. His eyes darted around the room, searching for threats, for whispers. He saw me in my box, watching him, and for the first time, I believe he understood he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The fear in his eyes was palpable. He knew something was coming, a tidal wave of consequence he could not outrun. The atmosphere in the Grand Theatre was thick with unspoken tension. People were no longer just watching the stage. They were watching us, sensing that the real drama was about to unfold not under the footlights, but in the unforgiving glare of the Crestwood Ballroom. The Grand Crestwood Ballroom was a sea of jewels and silk, shimmering under the light of 1,000 candles. Every influential family in the kingdom was present, drawn by the promise of my special announcement. Lord Marcus Thorn stood near the French doors, a pillar of feigned nonchalance, but his gaze never stopped moving, scanning the crowd. He looked like a man awaiting the hangman's noose. At precisely 10 o'clock, I signaled the orchestra to silence. A hush fell over the assembly. All eyes turned to me as I stood at the top of the grand staircase. "My lords, my ladies," I began, my voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Thank you for joining me. Tonight, we are here to correct a great and terrible injustice." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus's face was a mask of stone. "For months," I continued, "our society has accepted a cruel lie. A lie that destroyed a good woman's name and cast out a noble family. But tonight, the truth returns." As I spoke those words, the great oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and there she stood, Lady Ilara Vance. She was not the broken woman who had disappeared from Blackwood Manor. She was magnificent, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk, her bearing regal, her expression radiating a calm, unassailable power. Beside her stood my solicitor, holding a leather-bound folio. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, swept the room. It was as if a specter had materialized. People took an involuntary step back, clearing a path for her as she walked forward, her eyes fixed not on the stunned crowd, but solely on Marcus Thorn. "Lord Thorn." Ilara's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like diamond on glass. "You once publicly declared me a fortune hunter. I find myself wondering what you would call a man who learns of a woman's secret, vast inheritance, and schemes to marry her, only to destroy her reputation when he fears he cannot control her wealth." Marcus was frozen, his face ashen. The word inheritance hung in the air, connecting every piece of the puzzle for the stunned onlookers. My solicitor stepped forward. "This," he announced, holding up the folio, "is the certified last will and testament of the Earl of Silverwood, alongside his ciphered ledger. They name his sole heir, Lady Ilara Vance, now the mistress of the Silverwood estate and its entire fortune. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any sound. It was the sound of a reputation turning to dust. Every eye in the room shifted from Ilara to Marcus, their gazes filled with dawning comprehension, then contempt, then utter disgust. He was no longer a victim. He was a predator, unmasked in the most public arena imaginable. His social world had not just cracked. It had evaporated in a single devastating moment. Power had not just shifted, it had been reclaimed with breathtaking precision. The downfall of Lord Marcus Thorne was as swift as it was absolute. Society, having condemned Ilara with such venomous haste, now turned on him with the same ferocity. He was a pariah. His creditors, who had extended him funds based on the promise of his advantageous marriage, called in their debts immediately. Within a month, his estates were seized, his title a hollow shell. He vanished from the world we knew, not with a dramatic exit, but with the pathetic fizzle of a spent candle. Lady Ilara Vance, however, became the season's radiant sun. The Silverwood inheritance made her one of the most powerful women in the land, but it was not her fortune that commanded respect. It was her spirit. She moved through society not with triumph, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She had faced the worst the world could offer, public humiliation, betrayal, exile, and had emerged not scarred, but forged. I often saw her at Crestwood, walking through the gardens where we had once planned her return. She never spoke of Marcus or the scandal. She didn't have to. Her victory was in her composure, in the calm authority with which she now managed her vast affairs and the lives of those who depended on her. One crisp autumn evening, as we stood watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I finally asked the question that had lingered in my mind. "Were you ever afraid?" Ilara turned to me, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She gently touched the silver locket she always wore, the key to her past and her future. "Fear," she said softly, "is a cage you build for yourself." He thought he was locking me in one. He never realized I was the one holding the key.